What if we visit your mom next week? Mark suggested during dinner. He was slicing bread, glancing at me casually. I froze. To Vermont? I asked, as if I hadn't quite understood. Yes. You haven't seen her in a while, and I'd love to spend more time with your family. It's a good idea, isn't it? I slowly set my fork down. The memory of the last visit surfaced. A room filled with the scent of cinnamon and old books, my mom's voice coming from the kitchen. And Ron. I remembered his too loud laugh, the slightly drawn-out pauses before his words, those moments when he looked at me longer than he should have. Lily? Mark touched my hand. Are you okay? I blinked, coming back to reality. Yeah, of course. Just unexpected. I smiled, trying not to seem odd, but inside an unsettling feeling grew. After all, it was just a trip. A week, no more. Then it settled. Mark leaned over and kissed my forehead. I nodded, but I couldn't shake the feeling that this trip would be more complicated than I expected. As the car turned onto the familiar dirt road, I felt something tighten inside. The two-story house with white shutters stood just as it had before, surrounded by thick trees. On the porch, my mom was already waiting, light, bright, with her ever-present smile. Lily! She rushed to me, hugged me tightly with a warmth that, for a moment, chased away my anxious thoughts. Mark grabbed the suitcases and smiled as he shook her hand. It's good to see you again, Mrs. Grant. You too, Mark. Come on in. I stepped inside, and for a moment, everything was just like it had been in my childhood. The smell of apple pie, the soft light from the lamp in the corner. Lily, you look absolutely stunning, came a voice from behind. I turned around. Ron was standing in the doorway, casually leaning against the frame. Still the same relaxed, confident, with a slight smirk. Like a movie star, he added, his gaze running over me appraisingly. I forced a tight smile. Hi, Ron. Mark stepped closer to me, his hand resting on my waist, and I felt a little calmer. At dinner, my mom animatedly shared the latest news, laughed, and asked Mark about his work. But Ron? He looked at me more than was necessary. Asked how I was doing, what I was into, what I was reading. His voice was warm, but I couldn't shake the feeling there was something else in his words. I glanced quickly at Mark. He was smiling at my mom, engaged in conversation. Ron hardly paid him any attention. I lowered my eyes to my plate and picked up my fork, trying not to think that this was only the first evening. After dinner, my mom suggested we take a walk. The air was fresh, with the scent of damp grass and a distant campfire. Mark and I went out first, walking down the familiar path. He was telling me something funny. My mom was laughing, and I was trying to catch that light mood. But as soon as I slowed my pace, Ron appeared next to me. Do you still like walking here? His voice was too close. Yes, I replied shortly without looking at him. The forest path narrowed. I focused on the crunching leaves beneath my feet, trying to keep my distance. I finished the garage, he continued as if nothing had happened. You remember, it needed repairs for a while. Uh-huh, I nodded, hoping he'd back off. But he didn't. It's cozy now. You could even put a couch there. His voice carried a smile. Want to see it? I don't think so. I answered faster than I intended. I stumbled. The stone underfoot was slippery. The next moment, his hand landed on my shoulder, steadying me. Careful, Lily. His voice was gentle. I pulled away sharply, standing up straight. I'm fine, I said, trying not to meet his eyes. Ahead, Mark and my mom were discussing something, not noticing us. I took a step forward, catching up to them. Ron didn't say anything else. But I didn't like how long he kept staring after me. I woke up before everyone else. The house was quiet. Only the old grandfather clock in the living room ticking steadily, counting the seconds. I threw on a sweater and padded barefoot down to the kitchen. The air smelled of coffee and something vanilla-scented. My mom, of course, was already making breakfast. Good morning, sunshine, She smiled at me as she placed the toast on a plate. I smiled back, but inside, the unease still lingered. Last night's events were still in my mind, stirring up a strange feeling I wanted to shake off. I opened the cupboard to get a mug when I heard footsteps behind me. Good morning. I knew whose voice it was before I even turned around. Ron stood in the doorway, as casual and confident as ever. He was holding an old mug with the logo of some auto repair shop. He poured himself some coffee, sat down at the table, and looked at me with a slight smile. You haven't changed a bit, Lily. I froze. The words sounded strangely familiar. They came across as something natural, something I had heard before but hadn't given much thought to at the time. I remembered. I was 18. I was sitting on the porch with a book, the wind rustling the curtains in the open window. Ron had just come home from work, grabbed a beer from the fridge, and stopped in the doorway looking at me. You haven't changed a bit, Lily, he had said then with a slight smirk. I didn't even look up, just smirked back. But now, years later, those same words felt different. I swallowed, lowering my gaze. Thanks, I replied in a flat voice, pretending nothing was out of the ordinary. Is Mark still asleep? He asked, taking a sip of his coffee. I nodded. You're up early, he remarked. Yeah, just couldn't sleep. Ron smirked, as if it amused him. Mom was bustling around the stove, unaware of anything. I lowered my eyes to my cup, but I could feel him still watching me. The uneasy feeling hadn't gone away. It had only grown stronger. I felt a sense of relief as soon as we drove away from the house. Mark held the wheel with one hand, twiddling with the radio with the other, searching for something that wasn't irritating. The warm wind flowed into the windows, and beyond the trees, the view opened up onto the calm, autumn quiet city. So, what's going on with you? He asked, glancing at me. What? You seem not here. I bit my lip, trying to decide what to say. Just tired. Mark squinted but didn't press further. I stared out the window as if studying the landscape, but my thoughts kept drifting back to the kitchen, to the morning conversation with Ron. How he'd said those words, how he'd smiled, as if reminding me of something I'd rather forget. We parked on the main street, a small pedestrian zone, cozy cafes, an old bakery, and a bookstore with a window full of yellowed pages. Let's just forget about everything and have a nice day, Mark said, pulling me in for a hug. Like we used to. I nodded. We went into the bookstore. It smelled of old pages and coffee, and behind the counter stood a woman in her 50s with glasses perched on the tip of her nose. Mark immediately disappeared into the historical fiction section, while I grabbed the first book I saw and stared at its cover without even noticing what was depicted. Inside, the unease still lingered. Everything okay? Mark's voice came from beside me. I looked up. He was standing there, holding two books. Yeah, of course. I smiled, hoping he'd believe me. We bought a couple of books and stepped out onto the street. Coffee? He suggested. Yeah, good idea. We went into a small cafe on the corner. Inside, it smelled of vanilla and cinnamon, and someone was playing softly on a guitar. The waitresses in white aprons scurried between tables. We chose a seat by the window. Mark was talking about something funny. Work, plans, the idea of going somewhere in the winter. He smiled, joked. I nodded, responded, but my thoughts were still far away. I tried to focus on his voice, on the warmth of the cup in my hands, on the conversation that should have brought me back to reality. But as soon as I closed my eyes, I saw Ron's morning gaze again. And something inside me whispered that a day in the city was just a temporary break. The real unease was waiting for me at home. By the time we returned home, it was already starting to get dark. The soft glow of lights was visible through the windows, and cars were parked on the porch. My mom had guests. Oh, looks like we've stumbled into a party. Mark smirked as he locked the car. I just nodded. The house smelled of wine, roasted meat, and spices. In the living room sat my mom's old friends and the neighbors. They were all laughing, chatting, and sharing news. The atmosphere seemed warm and relaxed. Lily! My mom immediately jumped up to greet me. How was the trip? Good. I smiled, trying to seem natural. Mark quickly joined in on the conversation, and I grabbed a glass of wine, hoping I could simply blend into the noise of voices. But after a while, I felt someone watching me. I turned around. Ron was standing by the wall, a glass in his hand, watching me as if we were the only two people in the room. I turned away, pretending not to notice. What's with you? You seem tense? Mark asked, leaning in toward me. Just tired, I replied. Maybe we should go to bed early. I wanted to agree, but at that moment, Ron walked up to us. Lily, you've always known how to be the center of attention, he said, handing me a glass of wine. I took it, but didn't sip it. Lovely evening, isn't it? He added. I smiled, but felt something tighten inside. Ron didn't look away. Yeah, I replied shortly. Mark got distracted by someone else's question, and Ron stepped closer. You're happy to be back here, aren't you? He asked, almost whispering. I took a sip of wine, but didn't answer. He smiled, as if he knew I had something to say, but I wouldn't say it. I took a step back. Excuse me, I need to... I mumbled, heading for the door. It was cool on the porch. I took a deep breath, hoping the fresh air would help. But inside, the unease didn't go away. I knew this evening wasn't over yet. Late at night, after the guests had left and the house was once again consumed by silence, I stayed in the living room, cleaning up. Mom and Mark had already gone upstairs. I tried to focus on my task: shelves, glasses, wine, the remnants of dinner. But it all felt distant, unreal. I knew that Ron was staying behind, and for some reason, my heart started to beat faster. I tried not to think about it, quickly stacking plates and picking up glasses. Suddenly, I heard footsteps. He appeared like a shadow, and before I could turn away, the living room door closed behind him. You're still here? His voice came unexpectedly close. I froze, not turning around. Yes, I answered, continuing to clean. We never really talked, Lily, he said, sitting down in the chair. His gaze was firm, yet there was something oddly soft in it. I felt the tension inside me grow. What do you mean? I tried to speak calmly, not letting on how uncomfortable I was. He didn't answer immediately, just watched me as if trying to figure out what I was really thinking. You've changed a lot, he added, and there was not only a sense of observation in his words, but also regret. I felt his words start to seep into me, as if I had become transparent. I didn't want him to see me like that. I don't know what you're talking about, Ron. I slowly placed a plate in the sink, trying not to look at him. He seemed not to hear. Or maybe he didn't want to. His eyes were too persistent. You were different. You're not the same as before. You must feel it yourself. His voice softened, but there was no sympathy in it. I turned to face him, my gaze firm to hide the trembling inside. I don't think this is any of your business, Ron. I tried to mask my unease. He looked at me with confusion, as if I didn't quite understand what he was saying. You weren't always this closed off. I always said you needed to open up more, but you've shut yourself off. You're afraid of something. Or someone. My hands turned cold, like ice. I turned away, hoping he would stop talking. But he kept going, his words digging deeper, overshadowing my thoughts. Lily, you know I've always been there, and I could have helped if you'd let me. He leaned forward slightly, his voice almost a whisper. I stood there, not knowing what to say. My fingers clenched into fists. Silence buzzed in my mind, and only his words, like heavy stones, fell inside, making me feel lost and vulnerable. I took a step back, retreating. I think I should go, I said, my voice stumbling, trying to regain control. But he didn't move. He just sat there, as if waiting for me to agree, for me to say something else. I raised my head. I want to end this conversation. Please, Ron. He looked at me but didn't reply. I left the room, and when the door closed behind me, I felt something break inside. The morning arrived foggy and quiet. I woke up early before the sun had a chance to rise. The house was peaceful. Only a faint light seeped through the curtains, casting a soft gray glow in the room. I got out of bed, feeling a heaviness inside. The whole night had passed like a fog. That conversation with Ron, his words like sand, kept burying me deeper. I tried to shake them off, forget them, but they wouldn't let go. I quietly made my way to the kitchen, hoping the fresh coffee would help clear my thoughts. Mom was already making breakfast, and her presence instantly calmed me a little. She seemed just as she always was, bright, caring, full of energy. "Hey, sunshine." She smiled when she saw me. "You're up early. Everything okay?" I nodded, trying to put a smile on my face. "Yeah, just didn't sleep well." She didn't say anything, but I noticed how her gaze lingered on me. She probably sensed something was off, but she didn't ask. Mom had always been like that. She understood, but never pushed. I made myself a cup of coffee and sat at the table. Outside, it was quiet. The only sound was the wind in the trees. I tried to focus on that, but my thoughts kept drifting back to yesterday's conversation. His words. How could I have reacted? Why did everything feel so foreign and inexplicable? "You look tired today," Mark said, entering the kitchen. His gaze was warm and slightly concerned. He sat down beside me and grabbed a cup of coffee. I exhaled, trying to pull myself together. "I'm fine," I replied. "Just a lot on my mind." Mark looked at me closely but didn't press. "If you want, we could take it easy. Go somewhere, talk." He smiled, but in his eyes I saw the same unease that, like mine, wouldn't leave him. I shook my head. "No, let's just stay here, at your mom's. I need some time alone with my thoughts." He shrugged, understanding that I wasn't ready for long conversations, but I knew he felt it too. I could see it in his eyes. I took a sip of my coffee and glanced at the clock. It was time to make a decision, but I couldn't figure out what exactly that should be. Mom suggested having a picnic by the lake, and without hesitation, I agreed. It was the only thing that could distract me, even for a short while. To escape from the house, breathe in the fresh air, and talk about something simple and effortless. Mark was on board, as always, light and easygoing. With him, there was no need to think about how to act in the presence of others. I, on the other hand, no matter how hard I tried, couldn't shake the feeling that someone was constantly watching me. The lake greeted us with complete silence. Only the distant calls of birds pierced the air, and the water gently lapped against the shore. We spread out the blanket, and I sat down, leaning on my arm, trying not to think about what was happening around me. Mark went for a swim, his silhouette disappearing behind the curve of the water, and Mom started unpacking the food. The whole world felt so distant, so foreign. And again, I felt his presence. Ron approached me while I was sitting on the shore, staring at the water. He stopped nearby, not too close, but just enough that I could feel his gaze. "You're making things more complicated than they need to be, Lily," he said calmly, as always. I looked up at him, not hiding the unease his proximity caused. This wasn't something simple. He spoke as though he knew something more, as though he saw right through me, even when I tried to hide behind a mask of calmness. "What are you talking about?" I responded, trying to keep my voice steady. Ron looked at me. His gaze was confused, as though he couldn't understand why I didn't see what he was trying to tell me. "You know, if you just opened up, everything would be easier." His words sounded like a request I couldn't or didn't want to accept. I stood up and walked toward the car, toward the others, but Ron stayed where he was, motionless, watching me. Something inside me screamed to answer him, to put an end to this. But I couldn't. I didn't know how. I looked at Mark. He didn't seem to notice the tension between us. He was swimming and laughing as if there were no barriers in this world. But I felt the walls around me closing in, as if I was standing at the edge of a boundary I couldn't cross. and I didn't know which side of that boundary I was supposed to be on. Late at night, when the house had swallowed up the silence and everyone seemed to be asleep, I couldn't settle. I tossed and turned in bed, as though in the darkness I could find the answers to the questions that had been haunting me. I got up, quietly closed the door, and went downstairs to the living room. Everything was fine, everything was familiar, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Suddenly I heard footsteps. I froze, and within moments, like a shadow, he appeared. Mark. He stood in the doorway, and there was something in his eyes that I couldn't quite understand, but it was something important. He didn't say a word, just walked toward me. I felt his gaze penetrating me. He could see everything I was trying to hide. All the tense moments, all the hidden feelings, all the unspoken words. I know, he said softly. I just shook my head, trying to distract myself, but my heart was already beating faster. Know what? I asked, trying to hide the tremor in my voice. Everything that's happening. You can't hide it from me, Lily. I see how you've changed, how it's hard for you, how this place isn't giving you peace. I don't want you to feel alone. His words were warm, but they carried pain. I lowered my head, not knowing what to say. All I could do was stand there and be silent. You think I don't understand? Mark continued, moving a little closer. I see what's happening. I know what you're going through. But I'm here. I'm right here. I felt the tears welling up in my eyes, but I couldn't hold them back. I just stood there, unmoving, letting it all spill out. Mark? I barely whispered, but he was already holding my hand, looking into my eyes and silent, as if understanding that all I needed was to be heard. And in that moment, I realized that truth isn't always hidden behind words. Sometimes it's found in the silence, in what isn't said but still felt. Mark knew. He knew, and now I knew that I didn't have to hide anything. I could just be myself. Maybe this was the beginning of the end, or perhaps a new beginning. But in that moment, I felt that all that was needed for healing was a simple acknowledgement. Mark was here, and I was ready to take a step toward the truth, however bitter it might be. The next morning, when I woke up, Mark was already gone. Mom was sitting at the table, a cup of tea in her hands. The room was quiet, and only the light filtering through the windows broke the stillness. I sat at the table, trying to understand how everything had changed so much in just a few days. Yesterday's conversation with Mark left me with the feeling that something important had shifted. I couldn't say it was a sense of freedom, but it was a step forward. Mom noticed me glancing at her. She didn't ask, not insistently, but I felt her gaze. She knew something was weighing on me. You're not upset with him, are you? She asked, as always, without unnecessary words. I shook my head but didn't answer. My silence spoke louder than any words. Inside, there was an emptiness, and I didn't know how to fill it. I stood up, went to the window, and looked outside, where the tree had already shed almost all its leaves. A light breeze swayed the branches, and I felt so alone. I desperately wanted this week to end, but at the same time, I understood that perhaps this was the turning point in my life. I tried calling Mark, but his phone was off. I sent a message, and it remained unread. My hands were shaking, but I tried to stay calm. Mom came up to me and placed her hand on my shoulder. You're not saying anything, Lily. You know I'm always here for you. I nodded, but it was hard for me to speak. I felt like everything that had happened here was breaking free, but I couldn't find the words. The next morning, when I was gathering my things, I heard Ron enter the hallway. He stopped, looked at me, and said the very words I didn't want to hear. Don't leave like this, he said calmly. I silently walked past him. He didn't move. I could hear his gaze, but I couldn't respond. When I left the house, I felt my legs grow heavy. All the weight of the week stayed with me, and I didn't know what would come next. I drove home, and when I got to our apartment, I realized his things were gone. All that was left was emptiness, and for a while it would trap me in this space where I would be alone. Mark didn't respond to my calls. I sat on the porch, staring at the phone screen, trying to figure out what to do now. The sound of the empty beeps was the only sound in the silence. I didn't know where he was or what would happen next, but I realized that I needed to walk this path alone to find myself. Monday arrived, bringing with it a new feeling. The house was empty, just like my thoughts. I gathered my things in silence, each step feeling heavy as if I were moving in slow motion. Mom had gone to the store, and Ron, as usual, had disappeared into his workshop in the backyard. I wasn't sure what exactly scared me, the uncertainty of the future, or the fact that I hadn't gotten the answers to all the questions I'd been asking myself these past few days. I called Mark again, but the phone remained silent. It was terrifying to think that I might have ruined everything, or maybe everything had already been broken before, and I just couldn't see it until now. I sat on the couch and closed my eyes, trying to remember when everything started to go wrong. When did I stop feeling safe in this house? I thought back to my youth, when we were all young and carefree and this house felt like a fortress. But now, after coming back, it seemed foreign. Ron appeared in the doorway. He was wearing his old apron, with dirty hands that he usually wiped on his jeans, and his expression immediately made me feel like I was trapped once again. "Lily, I understand what you're thinking, but you can't just leave. You need to talk to him," he said calmly, though his voice had an undeniable insistence. I didn't answer. I couldn't say anything. I knew my words wouldn't change anything, that everything was already decided, but I needed to realize that for myself, without his interference. "You know you could lose him if you don't make a move. You can't run from this, Lily," he continued, stepping closer. I felt something strange rise inside me, a mix of anger and pain. But I stood in silence because anything I could say would have been unbearable for me. "I need to think," I finally said, retreating to my room. I closed the door, sat down on the bed, and felt a wave of emotions overwhelm me. My thoughts were swirling, and in that moment, I realized I couldn't continue like this. I needed to find the answers, and perhaps they were only with me. I didn't know what tomorrow would bring, but I felt that no matter how this story unfolded, I could no longer hide from myself. I sat in my room until evening, sifting through fragments of thoughts. Every item I packed into my suitcase seemed filled with memories. The framed photos, the old sweater, the forgotten journal. All of it brought me back to the past, but made me feel even more sharply that the present was slipping away from my grasp. As the night drew closer, when I had almost stopped hoping to hear from Mark, the phone briefly vibrated. I grabbed it instantly, but it was just a message from a colleague, a standard reminder about a deadline. I exhaled loudly, feeling an overwhelming sense of loss stir within me. Footsteps sounded in the hallway. Mom had returned with the groceries. I heard her moving around the kitchen, putting things away. If I had been calm, I would have helped her, but that evening I couldn't bring myself to get up. About half an hour later, the door creaked open and Mom quietly entered the room. She had an envelope in her hands. Simple, white, without stamps. "I found this in the mailbox," she said, handing it to me. "Looks like it's for you." I took the letter with surprise. My name was written neatly on the envelope. I hadn't expected anyone to send me a regular letter, since nowadays everyone uses messages or calls. Mom quietly left, leaving me alone with this unexpected surprise. I sat on the edge of the bed and carefully opened the envelope. Inside, there was a sheet of paper, written in neat lines. I quickly scanned the first sentence. It was Mark. "Lily, I know you're angry and probably don't want to talk to me, but I can't leave things like this. I'm sorry I left without explaining. I needed to be alone with my thoughts." I read the letter in full, twice, feeling a strange mixture of relief and guilt rise deep within me. He wrote that he didn't want to lose what we had, but that he needed to figure out how to handle difficult situations. He had been waiting for my honesty, but felt that I had shut myself off. At the end of the letter, he asked me to call when I was ready, and said he believed we could still find a way forward together. I leaned back on the pillows, holding the letter in my lap. Mark's words felt as though he were speaking them right now, beside me. Inside, something ached painfully, realizing that I didn't know how to deal with the weight I had been carrying. Still, a quiet sense of resolve began to rise within me. Mark had given me a choice. He hadn't imposed, hadn't tried to prove he was right. He acknowledged that he had made a mistake by leaving. But now, he had given me time and space to take the step myself. I sat for a few minutes, clutching the letter in my hands. Then I stood up, took my phone, and dialed his number. I heard the familiar rings. Even though he didn't pick up, I left a voicemail. My voice was uncertain. I stumbled over my words, but I still managed to say the most important thing. That I didn't want to lose him. That I needed time. But it mattered to me that he was still there. When I hit the end button, I felt tears rolling down my cheeks. It was a strange relief, as if I had done something terrifying, but also right. Late that night, as I lay in bed, I suddenly realized that despite all the difficulties, I had found a sense of purpose. And in order to reach it, I would have to stay and face it, not run away. And perhaps now, I was ready for that.